Julia Myers had never thought she would start her life over in a quiet suburb outside of Portland, but after the unraveling of her marriage and the exhaustion of years spent in a downtown apartment that seemed to echo with everything she wanted to forget, she found herself drawn to the idea of building a life around a house she could shape with her own hands. She was an architect by training and by passion, but she had spent too long working on projects that belonged to clients with bottomless budgets and endless demands. Her own sense of space, her own ideas of structure and harmony, had been pushed aside. The house she bought was not grand in size, nor particularly striking from the outside. It was a modest two-story with white trim, a sloped roof that caught the sun beautifully at dusk, and a backyard framed by a tall wooden fence that felt to Julia like more than just boards and nails. That fence was a statement of independence, a tangible boundary between her and a world that had so often asked too much of her. The move had been quiet. Julia did not throw parties or make introductions with baskets of muffins. She did not wander door to door, asking names or learning the histories of the neighborhood. She believed that in time people would reveal themselves naturally, and that good fences did in fact make good neighbors. For the most part, this proved correct. The family across the street waved occasionally but did not pry. An older couple 2 doors down kept to themselves, and the children who rode their bikes in the evenings seemed to understand not to cut across her lawn. But there was one neighbor who did not keep to herself, who did not respect distance or subtle boundaries, and that was Karen Dalton. Karen was a woman in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed even when taking out the trash, her SUV always washed and gleaming, her voice carrying across yards when she called out to whomever she chose to speak with. She had lost her husband some years back, a fact she mentioned in a way that sounded less like grief and more like currency, as though it granted her authority in the neighborhood. She was active in the Homeowners Association and seemed to treat her role as a kind of neighborhood watch mixed with personal dominion. Julia, who had always been polite but distant, noticed almost immediately that Karen's SUV was parked too often near her own gate, sometimes blocking the view down the street as if deliberately placed there. At first, Julia dismissed it as coincidence. Perhaps the driveway was full, or perhaps Karen simply preferred parking there. But in time, she realized that the vehicle felt like a presence, a shadow looming over her attempts at solitude. Despite these intrusions, Julia found solace in her work. She was developing a new project for the city, sketching designs that aimed to balance functionality with warmth, and the hours she spent bent over her drafting table with coffee growing cold nearby were the hours she felt most herself. The house had become her studio as much as her home, and she believed that the wooden fence, though plain, gave her the quiet she needed. When autumn came, she began tending to the garden along the inner edge of the fence, planting shrubs that would one day bloom into something dense and colorful, a living barrier inside the wooden one. She imagined it as an extension of herself, orderly, intentional, protective. It was in these small, careful routines that Julia began to notice Karen more closely. She saw the woman lingering near the end of the driveway, talking to passers-by with her eyes darting toward Julia's yard. She noticed Karen's gaze resting too long on the house itself, her expression unreadable but never warm. Once, while Julia was sketching near the open window upstairs, she heard Karen's voice carried by the breeze, sharp and clipped as she spoke on the phone. Something about the transfer and not yet secure. The words had struck Julia as oddly clinical, far too precise to be casual gossip, but she dismissed it quickly, convincing herself she had misheard or that Karen was speaking about something trivial. Still, the sound lodged itself in her memory, like a splinter she could not remove. For all her suspicion, Julia tried to keep her life detached from neighborhood politics. She did not attend HOA meetings. She did not respond to Karen's pointed comments about keeping up appearances, and she certainly did not intend to be dragged into someone else's affairs. Yet a subtle unease had begun to form in her chest. It was the unease of someone who has built a fragile but precious sense of safety, and feels it tested in ways too minor to justify confrontation, but too persistent to ignore. Each time Karen's SUV loomed in front of her gate, each time Julia heard her voice cutting across the quiet street, each time she caught a glance that lingered too long, the feeling grew. The house was her sanctuary, the fence her shield, and she clung to the belief that both would hold. What Julia did not yet realize was that the ordinary fabric of suburban life she had woven so carefully was already fraying. The fence she had imagined as a barrier would soon become the center of a confrontation so strange and so threatening that she would question not just her neighbor's intentions, but the very reality of what her new home represented. Karen Dalton was not simply a meddling widow with too much time and too much authority in the homeowners association. She was a woman carrying secrets heavy enough to shatter fences, reputations, and even the quiet refuge Julia had fought to build. And the first crack in that refuge would not be a whispered rumor or an officious letter from the HOA. It would be the sound of metal and wood splintering beneath the force of Karen's SUV. The night it happened was one of those evenings Julia had begun to cherish since moving into the house. Cool enough for a sweater, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves, and a kind of suburban stillness that made her believe she had finally chosen the right place to rebuild her life. She was upstairs, working at her drafting table with a lamp throwing warm light over her sketches, when the sudden roar of an engine cut through the quiet like a blade. At first she ignored it, assuming it was just one of the neighborhood teenagers speeding down the street. But the sound grew louder, closer, until the vibration seemed to pass through the very walls of her house. Then came the impact, sharp and brutal, followed by the screech of wood splitting and the metallic groan of a fence post tearing free from the ground. Julia's pencil snapped in her hand as she froze, listening, her heart hammering in her chest. By the time she ran to the window, the air outside was filled with the acrid smell of burned rubber and splintered cedar, and Karen Dalton's dark SUV sat angled across her yard, its headlights glaring like unblinking eyes. Julia rushed outside without thinking, her shoes sinking into the damp earth as she stared at the wreckage. The section of fence she had spent weeks repairing and staining had been smashed clean through, boards scattered like matchsticks, the carefully planted shrubs uprooted and half buried under the heavy front bumper of the SUV. Karen was behind the wheel, gripping it tightly, her face pale in the wash of the dashboard lights. For a moment, Julia thought the woman might be injured, but when Karen turned her head, the expression she saw was not pain. It was something closer to calculation, like a person trying to decide on a story before anyone asked a question. Julia approached cautiously, her anger tempered by confusion. "Are you all right?" she asked, but Karen did not answer immediately. She opened the door slowly, stepped out with movements that seemed rehearsed rather than dazed, and brushed at her sleeve as if the accident had been a minor inconvenience. "Road was slick," she muttered, though the street was dry. Her tone was defensive, clipped, as though Julia had accused her of something rather than simply asked. Before Julia could press further, the faint wail of sirens reached them, startling her with its speed. She had not called anyone, yet police cars were already pulling into the street, lights flashing against the ruined boards. The officers who emerged were not the kind Julia had expected in a suburban neighborhood responding to what should have been a traffic accident. They moved with an efficiency that felt oddly formal, scanning the scene with too much intensity for what lay before them. One of them approached Julia, asked for her name, then glanced at the fence as though its destruction was a footnote rather than the main event. Karen, meanwhile, was separated from Julia almost immediately, ushered aside by another officer who spoke to her in low tones. Julia could not hear the words, but she saw the way Karen's jaw tightened and her eyes flicked toward the broken fence with something like irritation rather than remorse. When Julia tried to explain that this was her property, that her fence had been destroyed and she needed to know how to proceed, the officer listening to her barely took notes. His gaze drifted repeatedly toward the ground near the base of the fence, to the churned soil and the exposed roots. He finally leaned closer, his voice low enough that she almost didn't catch it. Do not repair the fence yet. Just wait. Leave it as it is. The words struck her as strange, almost absurd. What homeowner would be told not to fix damage to their own property? But the officer offered no further explanation, only a curt nod before moving to confer with his colleagues. The scene resolved itself in a way that left Julia unsettled. Karen was not given a citation, nor were any sobriety tests performed, though Julia noticed no scent of alcohol, no stumbling that would have explained her driving into the yard. Instead, the SUV was backed slowly onto the street, its headlights still cutting into Julia's house, and Karen was allowed to drive away as if nothing had happened. The officers remained for a few minutes longer, circling the wreckage of the fence with their flashlights, occasionally marking something in the dirt with chalk, before departing just as abruptly as they had arrived. When Julia asked again if she should file an insurance claim, if there was paperwork she needed, one officer simply repeated, "Wait, do nothing until you hear from us alone." At last, Julia stood in the ruined gap where her fence had once been, the cool night air pressing against her skin, her mind struggling to reconcile what had just unfolded. The destruction itself was upsetting. This fence had been both symbolic and practical, her shield from the outside world, but it was the behavior of those who had responded that unsettled her most. Why had the police treated the scene less like an accident and more like a crime scene? Why had Karen looked less shaken than irritated, her eyes flashing with a kind of defiance when they met Julia's across the yard? Why had she been allowed to leave without consequence? In the following days, the strangeness only deepened. Julia noticed subtle signs that her yard had been visited in her absence. A footprint in the soil where the shrubs had been torn out, a faint scrape on one of the boards that had not been there the night before. Once, when she returned home from the grocery store, she found a small, unmarked stake driven into the ground a few feet from the broken fence, painted red at the top, as if part of some survey. She removed it immediately, but the unease it left behind lingered. The neighborhood itself seemed to grow quieter, neighbors looking away rather than asking questions about the obvious damage. And every morning, Karen's SUV reappeared near her gate, idling at odd hours, the woman inside staring straight ahead with hands clenched on the wheel. Julia wanted desperately to dismiss it all as coincidence, to believe that the officers had reasons she simply did not understand, and that Karen's behavior was nothing more than the stubborn pride of a woman embarrassed by her mistake. But the image of that officer leaning close, his voice dropping into something almost conspiratorial, replayed again and again. Do not repair the fence yet. Just wait. The words felt less like advice and more like a warning, and Julia could not shake the feeling that her quiet refuge had been pulled into a current she had no way of resisting. What had begun as a simple accident was revealing itself as something calculated, something dangerous, and the broken fence that had once stood as her barrier now gaped open like a wound, inviting everything she had tried to escape to come rushing back in. Julia could not bring herself to accept the police officer's advice as something rational, yet she also could not ignore it. Days passed with the gap in the fence gaping open like an unfinished thought, and every time she walked past it she felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the entire neighborhood were silently peering into her life. She told herself she would wait a little longer before calling a contractor, convincing herself that there might be legal complications or paperwork coming her way. But the truth was that the strange way the officers had behaved had left her unsettled, and the memory of the chalk marks on the ground near the wreckage gnawed at her. They had treated her yard as though something of value had been hidden there, as though the boards and posts were less important than what lay beneath them. What unsettled her more was Karen's behavior in the days that followed. Rather than apologizing or even acknowledging the damage, Karen seemed emboldened. She appeared in the yard at odd hours, sometimes with gardening gloves on, though she never actually touched the soil, sometimes with her phone pressed to her ear, her voice carrying fragments of words that felt deliberately sharp. Secure. Transfer. Not exposed. Julia wanted to believe she was imagining connections where there were none. But one evening, as she collected her mail, she caught Karen staring at the wreckage with something closer to hostility than guilt. When their eyes met, Karen crossed the street slowly. Her SUV parked once again in front of Julia's gate and stopped so close that Julia could smell the perfume clinging to her coat. "That fence," Karen said, her voice soft but heavy with insinuation, "was never meant to stand so close to my property line. You might want to think carefully before you rebuild it." Julia blinked, stunned by the audacity. "The property line is clearly marked." "I have the deed and the survey." She had no patience for manufactured disputes, yet Karen's expression only hardened, her lips twisting into something that was almost a smile. "Deeds and surveys change," she replied, and with that she turned away, leaving Julia with the chilling impression that the woman was not making a legal claim but issuing a warning. Later that night, as Julia sat at her drafting table trying to lose herself in work, she heard movement outside near the broken fence. At first, she thought it was just the wind pushing through the loose boards, but when she turned off her lamp and leaned close to the darkened window, she saw the faint glow of a flashlight cutting across the soil. Someone was there, crouched low, inspecting the ground. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she realized it was not Karen but a man she did not recognize, his face obscured by a hood pulled tight, his hands brushing over the churned dirt as if searching for something. Before she could even consider calling the police, he straightened abruptly, as though sensing her eyes on him, and vanished into the shadows between the houses without a sound. The next morning, Julia found something she was certain had not been there before. Near the base of one of the splintered posts, half buried under the loose soil, was a small metal object no larger than a key fob. It was scratched, dented, and had no obvious markings except for a faint serial number etched into the surface. She turned it over in her hand again and again, wondering whether it had been dropped by the hooded man or left there intentionally. It was heavy for its size, and when she shook it lightly she felt something shift inside. Against her better judgment, she slipped it into her desk drawer, telling herself she would decide later whether to hand it over to the police. Karen's hostility escalated with unnerving speed. 2 days after Julia found the object, a letter appeared in her mailbox printed on Homeowners Association letterhead, accusing her of allowing her property to become an eyesore and threatening fines if the fence was not repaired. The hypocrisy of it struck her like a slap. The same neighbors who had told her not to fix the fence were now threatening her for not doing so. When Julia confronted Karen about it, the older woman's response was chilling. Standing with her hands folded across her chest, she said in a low voice, "You think this is about your fence, but it isn't. You're in the middle of something you don't understand. The smart thing would be to stay quiet and stop asking questions." The words left Julia shaken, not least because they echoed the officer's strange warning on the night of the crash. She began to notice other details that deepened her unease. Cars she did not recognize parked at the end of the street with drivers who never stepped out. A man in a brown jacket who walked past her house 3 times in the same afternoon without looking up. Once, while gardening to calm herself, she unearthed another small marker near the fence line, this one painted blue, and when she returned from disposing of it in the trash, she found her mailbox door open, though she had not touched it. Sleep became difficult. Every creak of the house seemed amplified. Every flicker of headlights outside her window jolted her awake. She began to feel less like a homeowner and more like an intruder in her own property, watched from angles she could not see. Karen's SUV appeared at odd hours, engine idling, the woman behind the wheel staring straight ahead as if staking her claim on the silence. Julia considered calling the police again, but the memory of their detachment, their refusal to treat the crash as anything more than a minor incident, held her back. What if they were not there to help her at all? What if they were part of the very thing Karen was hinting at? The turning point came one evening when Julia returned home to find her front gate ajar. She always kept it latched, but now it swung gently in the breeze, the chain broken clean through. On the steps leading to her porch lay a single piece of folded paper. She unfolded it with trembling hands and read the message scrawled in thick black marker. "Leave it alone." There was no signature, no explanation, just the unmistakable threat of someone who wanted her silence. For the first time since moving into the house, Julia considered leaving altogether, abandoning the idea of rebuilding and starting fresh somewhere else. But as she stood in the broken gap of her fence, the message still in her hand, she felt something stir in her, a resistance born not of recklessness but of exhaustion. She had come here to build a life on her own terms, to design her own boundaries, to finally take control of her existence. If Karen Dalton or anyone else thought they could intimidate her into surrender, they had chosen the wrong neighbor. The sense that her home was no longer her own had been gnawing at Julia for days, and by the time the knock came at her door, she was already living with the constant hum of dread that made every sound feel amplified and every silence feel deliberate. It was late afternoon, the kind of overcast gray that flattened the colors of the neighborhood into shades of dull stone, when she opened the door and saw a man standing on her porch. He was tall, neatly dressed in a dark coat that looked too heavy for the season, and he carried himself with the kind of self-assured calm that immediately set her on edge. He introduced himself with a quiet authority, claimed to be with the FBI, and produced a leather wallet that he flipped open just long enough for her to glimpse an emblem and an ID card before sliding it back into his pocket with practiced ease. Something about the motion struck her as rehearsed, and she felt her instincts rise in protest even as she forced herself to remain polite. The man explained in a voice low enough that it seemed intended for her ears alone that there was an ongoing investigation connected to her neighbor, Karen Dalton. He told her there was nothing to fear, that Karen had simply made herself the subject of federal attention, and that the SUV crash into the fence was not the accident it appeared to be. He asked with unnerving precision whether Julia had discovered anything unusual among the wreckage: papers, electronics, containers that did not belong. The way he phrased the question felt less like a request for help and more like a test, as though he already knew the answer and was waiting to see what she would admit. Julia, recalling the small metal object she had hidden in her desk drawer, forced her expression to remain neutral and said she had found nothing but broken boards and uprooted shrubs. For the briefest moment his eyes lingered on hers with a searching intensity, and she thought she detected disappointment, though he covered it quickly with a faint smile. He gave her a phone number written on a card, instructing her to call if she noticed anything suspicious, then warned her that Karen might attempt to involve her in things best left alone. The card looked official enough, printed on heavy paper with an embossed seal, but Julia could not shake the sense that something was off. After he left, walking down her drive with a deliberate slowness, she studied the card again and noticed the phone number was incomplete, missing a digit, as though it had been intentionally designed to fail if she tried to use it. She felt her hands grow cold as she realized she had just spoken to someone pretending to be an FBI agent, someone who knew or suspected she had stumbled onto something connected to Karen, and someone who had taken the risk of approaching her, directly in broad daylight. That night she could not concentrate on her work. The presence of the metal object in her desk drawer seemed to radiate through the room, filling the air with tension, and she finally retrieved it, holding it in her hands as though it might explain itself. She examined the serial number more closely, copying it down, and tried searching for it online. To her surprise, the search yielded nothing directly, but after trying variations, she stumbled across references in obscure forums discussing law enforcement technology. The descriptions matched the dimensions of what she held: a microtransmitter designed to conceal location data, the kind of device used to track shipments or mark contraband. The thought that something like this had been hidden in her fence made her feel physically ill. Over the following days, Julia became hyper-aware of Karen's movements. The older woman seemed less cautious now, striding past Julia's open gap in the fence with a look of ownership, speaking to neighbors with gestures that pointed toward Julia's yard, and lingering by her SUV for long minutes as though waiting for someone. Once, Julia caught a glimpse of Karen standing in her driveway late at night, a phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp and hurried, though Julia could only make out fragments through the window. "She knows. It's not secure. I told them." The implication that Julia herself had become part of whatever conversation Karen was having chilled her. Unable to endure the silence, Julia finally drove to the county office to review records of her property, hoping to find reassurance in something concrete. What she found only deepened her unease. The clerk, after some searching, confirmed that the deed and survey were in order, but mentioned casually that there had been a request for access to the property line records filed just a few weeks earlier. When Julia asked who had made the request, the clerk hesitated, then admitted that it had been submitted under a name she did not recognize, accompanied by documents that had since been flagged as potentially fraudulent. The implication was clear. Someone was attempting to manipulate official records connected to her home, and the timing coincided precisely with Karen's sudden insistence that the fence encroached on her property. Driving back through the familiar streets, Julia felt the weight of the situation pressing in on her. This was no longer about neighborhood disputes or the pettiness of an intrusive neighbor. She had become entangled in something involving falsified documents, hidden devices, and impersonation of federal agents. The open gap in her fence no longer symbolized vulnerability. It was now the literal stage on which a conflict far beyond her understanding was being played out. The confirmation came sooner than she expected. 2 nights later, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she heard movement outside again, deliberate and methodical. She crept to the window and saw 2 men working near the broken section of fence. One of them crouched low, shining a narrow-beamed flashlight into the soil, while the other stood watch, scanning the street. They were not teenagers or bored vandals. Their posture and equipment spoke of professionalism. Julia's stomach twisted as she realized they were looking for the very object she had already found. The urge to call the police surged through her, but she stopped herself, remembering the incomplete phone number on the false agent's card, the strange behavior of the officers who had first arrived, and Karen's chilling words about things she did not understand. For the first time, Julia admitted to herself that the police might not be neutral, that calling them could expose her instead of protecting her. She backed away from the window, clutching the metal transmitter she had retrieved earlier, and understood that she was in possession of something that tied her to whatever scheme was unfolding around her. The next morning, she received another letter in her mailbox, this one unmarked but written in the same thick black marker as the first threat. It read simply, "Return what you found, or the next accident won't be the fence." She stood at her mailbox with the note trembling in her hands, the suburban street around her as still and ordinary as ever, and she felt the strange, disorienting truth settle on her. She was no longer a bystander. She was a participant, unwilling perhaps, but trapped nonetheless, and the decisions she made from this point forward would determine not only whether she could hold on to her home, but whether she could keep herself safe from neighbors and strangers, alike who were playing a game she was only beginning to glimpse. Julia began to notice the change in the atmosphere almost immediately after the threatening note appeared in her mailbox. It was not a single overwhelming act, but rather a steady accumulation of small intrusions, each one subtle enough to dismiss on its own, yet together forming a pattern of deliberate pressure. Her garbage bins were overturned twice in the same week, scattering trash across her driveway, though she knew she had secured them tightly. A package she was expecting from a supplier never arrived, only for her to discover later that it had been marked as delivered, despite never reaching her doorstep. Once, she returned home from the store to find her front gate propped wide open again, as though someone had walked deliberately into her yard, and though nothing seemed missing, the knowledge that strangers could come and go without her consent hollowed out whatever fragile sense of security she had left. Karen's presence in all this was unmistakable, even if she never admitted it openly. The older woman seemed emboldened, her eyes carrying a smug glint whenever their paths crossed, her words increasingly pointed. One afternoon, Julia found her standing directly inside the ruined gap in the fence, not on her own side but on Julia's property, her arms folded as she surveyed the yard. "It looks worse every day," she remarked with a false sigh of sympathy, "but then again, perhaps it is for the best." "Some things are meant to be exposed," Julia told her firmly to leave, her voice trembling with anger. But Karen only tilted her head and smiled as if Julia's indignation were proof that the intimidation was working. The Homeowners Association joined in, whether at Karen's instigation or as part of something larger Julia could not yet determine. Formal letters began to arrive, citing violations she had never heard of before: failure to maintain proper boundary structures, negligence in addressing damaged landscaping, unauthorized modifications to the exterior of her home. Each letter threatened escalating fines, though Julia had records to prove her compliance on every point prior to the crash. When she attempted to call the association office, her messages went unanswered. When she sent emails with scanned copies of her documents, no one replied. The silence felt intentional, a bureaucratic wall erected to isolate her. One night, exhausted and unable to sleep, Julia walked through the house in darkness, pausing at the back window that overlooked the ruined fence. The moonlight caught on something metallic, and for a moment she thought it was just another fragment of splintered nails. But when she stepped outside to check, she found a fresh set of survey stakes driven into the ground just beyond the gap. They were taller than the one she had found before, each topped with fluorescent paint, and their placement implied a shift in the property line that would have ceded several feet of her yard to Karen's side. The implication was undeniable. Someone was attempting to rewrite the very boundaries of her home under the cover of night. Julia yanked the stakes from the soil, her breath sharp in the cold air, but by morning new ones had appeared in their place. That same afternoon she overheard Karen speaking to another neighbor near the curb, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "Boundaries aren't always what people think they are. Some of us know the real history here." The neighbor looked uncomfortable, nodded without comment, and quickly walked away, leaving Karen standing there with the unmistakable satisfaction of someone spreading doubt. The psychological pressure intensified when Julia began receiving calls at odd hours. The caller ID was always blocked, and when she answered she was met with silence except for the faint sound of breathing before the line disconnected. At first she tried to convince herself it was some kind of technical error or prank, but the timing was too precise, always after midnight, always just as she was beginning to drift toward sleep. Her body learned to anticipate the calls, leaving her restless even when the phone remained silent. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Julia resolved she could no longer remain passive. She retrieved the small metal device she had hidden, the one she now believed to be a transmitter, and placed it on the table before her like a puzzle demanding to be solved. She considered turning it in anonymously, leaving it at a government office or dropping it in a public place, but the memory of the false agent on her porch and the incomplete number on his card stopped her. Whoever had planted the device clearly had resources, and whoever was looking for it believed she had it. Returning it would not make her invisible again. It would simply mark her as someone who had touched the secret at the heart of this conflict. The next day, she noticed Karen's SUV parked not only in its usual place by the gate, but also idling near the end of the street when Julia left for work. It followed her at a distance as she drove toward town, disappearing only when she entered a busier road. She tried to tell herself it was coincidence, but the pattern repeated on more than one occasion, and the realization that Karen was tracking her movements in daylight shook her as much as the nocturnal intrusions. Julia's sense of isolation grew unbearable when a certified letter arrived, this one not from the association but from a local law office. It claimed that Karen Dalton had initiated proceedings to dispute the boundary between their properties, attaching a crude map that bore little resemblance to the actual boundary resemblance to the official survey, but carried a notary stamp that Julia suspected had been forged. Reading the letter in her kitchen, Julia felt a wave of disbelief crash into fury. She had done nothing wrong, had complied with every rule, and yet here she was, forced into a defensive position by a neighbor who had not only destroyed her fence but was now attempting to erase the ground on which it had stood. That night, Julia sat in the broken opening of her yard, the cool air carrying the sound of insects and the occasional distant car, and felt the enormity of her situation press down on her. She was entangled in a scheme that was at once intimate and vast, rooted in the pettiness of neighborhood politics, yet infused with the unmistakable weight of something larger: fraudulent documents, surveillance devices, impersonations, and threats that moved through official channels as easily as whispered gossip. The escalation was no longer subtle. It was a campaign, deliberate and sustained, designed to wear her down until she either surrendered or made a mistake. And as she stared into the dark outline of Karen's house, a single truth hardened inside her. She could not retreat. If she yielded now, she would lose not just her fence, not just her yard, but the very right to claim the space she had built as her sanctuary. The storm finally broke not with subtlety, but with a spectacle that forced the entire neighborhood to witness what Julia had long suspected was building behind the ordinary facades of suburban order. It happened on a Thursday evening, when the Homeowners Association had scheduled one of their routine gatherings in the small community hall at the end of the street. Julia had not planned to attend. She had never attended before, preferring to keep her distance from the petty power games that seemed to animate those meetings. But that night Karen herself delivered a notice to her door insisting on her presence, her words dripping with the confidence of someone certain she was about to triumph. Julia hesitated, torn between avoidance and defiance, until the thought of Karen twisting her silence into guilt propelled her forward. She carried in her bag the small metal transmitter, wrapped carefully in cloth, and a recording she had made of Karen's late-night phone call when her voice had carried through the open air with careless recklessness. The hall was already filled when Julia arrived, neighbors seated in folding chairs arranged in rows, the buzz of conversation underscored by the rustle of papers and the metallic clink of a coffee urn on a side table. At the front stood Karen, her posture commanding, her voice already raised as she spoke about responsibility and property integrity. She gestured repeatedly toward Julia as though presenting a case to a jury, accusing her of negligence, of encroachment, of harboring structures that violated the bylaws. Julia felt the weight of every eye turned toward her, some sympathetic, some skeptical, but all waiting for her response. She rose slowly, her hands steady though her pulse thundered in her ears, and placed the wrapped object on the table before her. "This," she said, her voice clear and carrying farther than she expected, "was hidden in my fence. It does not belong to me, and it was never meant for me to find. But I did find it, and I know who it was meant for." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shifting of chairs as neighbors leaned forward. Karen's face stiffened, her expression cracking under the pressure of the moment, and for the first time Julia saw panic flicker behind the woman's carefully constructed mask. She began to speak, her tone shrill and defensive, insisting that Julia was fabricating evidence, that she had planted the device herself, that the real violation was the fence encroaching on property that was never truly hers. But the words faltered when Julia produced the recording from her phone, Karen's own voice filling the room with phrases too specific to dismiss. "She knows. Not secure. I told them." The effect was immediate. The neighbors, who had been uncertain, now shifted away from Karen, murmuring to one another, and even the members of the association board exchanged uneasy glances. Before Karen could gather herself to retaliate, the doors at the back of the hall burst open and several agents in dark jackets entered, their presence unmistakable. The letters FBI were stenciled in stark yellow across their backs, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from petty bureaucracy to something charged with the gravity of federal intervention. One of the agents strode forward, announced that they were there to serve warrants, and moved directly toward Karen, who stumbled backward as though the floor had betrayed her. She tried to protest, raising her hands, insisting on her innocence, but the evidence was already in motion. Julia watched as the transmitter was sealed into an evidence bag, the agent's eyes confirming what she had suspected all along. It was not just a piece of junk, but a key to a larger operation that Karen had been desperate to protect. The arrest itself unfolded with startling efficiency. Karen struggled, her voice rising in a shriek as she accused Julia of betrayal, of ruining everything, of not understanding the forces she had interfered with. "You think this ends with me?" she shouted as the agents led her toward the door, her words echoing in the stunned silence of the hall. "You've made enemies you don't even see yet. You've destroyed something bigger than all of us." The neighbors sat frozen, caught between fear and fascination, as the woman who had once dictated their landscaping choices and enforced their HOA fines was marched past them in handcuffs. Julia stood still, her body taut with adrenaline, watching the scene unfold as though it were both a victory and a warning. She had defended her home, she had exposed the lies, but she could not ignore the weight of Karen's final words. The truth was larger than she had anticipated, and though the immediate threat had been removed, she knew that the currents of whatever scheme Karen had been involved in did not end at the edge of their quiet street. As the doors closed behind the agents and their prisoner, the room exhaled as one, neighbors turning to Julia with a mixture of gratitude and unease. She felt no triumph in their looks, only the heavy knowledge that she had been forced into a battle she had never sought and had won only because she refused to surrender her ground. The climax was not the end of the story, but the tearing away of its disguise. And as Julia gathered her things and left the hall, she understood that the true work of reclaiming her sanctuary was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed the night of Karen's arrest, the neighborhood settled into a silence that felt entirely different from the one Julia had first encountered when she moved in. It was no longer the quiet of indifference, where neighbors kept their distance and left one another to their own routines, but rather the quiet that follows a storm, when the air still trembles with what has passed and everyone steps more carefully, aware of how fragile their sense of order had been. People who had barely acknowledged Julia before now greeted her with nods or small words of support, as though recognizing that she had stood against something that could just as easily have swallowed them. They did not ask for details, nor did she offer them, but the unspoken shift was clear. Karen's fall had broken a spell, and the community was no longer hers to command. Julia devoted herself to repairing her fence, not out of pettiness or defiance, but because it symbolized the very boundary she had fought to preserve. The boards were replaced slowly, each one measured and leveled with the care of an architect who knew that form and meaning could not be separated. When she hammered the final nail and stood back to look at the solid line once more enclosing her yard, she felt not only relief but a deep sense of reclaiming what had nearly been taken from her. The fence was stronger now, not just in its structure but in what it represented, her refusal to be intimidated, her insistence on defining her own space. There were still moments when unease stirred, an unmarked car idling too long at the corner, or the memory of Karen's voice insisting that larger forces were at play. But Julia learned not to let them dominate her. She planted new shrubs along the inner edge of the fence, not just for beauty but as a living reminder that growth could follow destruction. As she watered them in the fading light one evening, she realized she no longer felt like an intruder in her own life. The house was hers again, and though scars remained, they had become part of the design rather than flaws to be hidden. The neighborhood would talk about Karen for years, she was sure of it, but Julia did not care for the gossip. What mattered was that when the line was tested, she had not stepped back. She had discovered resilience she had not known she possessed, and in the quiet that returned to her yard she found something close to peace, not the fragile peace of isolation, but the earned peace of someone who had defended her ground and emerged, finally unshaken.